Today, as the children's sermon kind of pointed toward, we're going to begin a new sermon series on the Ten Commandments. Now, the first thing you're probably thinking is, wait a second, you're a guest speaker. And that's correct. Usually Anthony has me come maybe 2-3 times a year to speak. So this could be the longest sermon series you've ever had on the Ten Commandments, because it might take 4 or 5 years. But no, generally, when I would say something like, we're going to begin a new sermon series on the Ten Commandments, you would get 2 responses. First might go something like this: well, it's about time. We need to get down to some basic core truths and lay out a law code for this generation. The opposite response, and another response you might hear at the same time from somebody else, might go something like this: legalism. Didn't Jesus just tell us to love one another? Most people, when they look at the Ten Commandments, either positively or negatively, simply see a list of do's and don'ts. And many people today also believe that they don't really apply anymore. They're kind of antiquated, or maybe they've been superseded by Jesus and the church. But I still remember a quote, and it's a good enough quote that I can almost picture the newscast itself. I remember a quote from back in the mid-'90s when, and I apologize, I don't remember who was Pope then, but I remember it was a comment that the Pope made because some American Catholics were saying, can't we kind of relax a little bit on the Ten Commandments? And his response, I still think it's the most classic response, very simple: they are the 10 Commandments, not the 10 suggestions. They are often in dispute in the public arena, but the 10 Commandments have stood the test of time because they are more than just mere suggestions. They're more than just a list of do's and don'ts. They are actually foundational to our relationship with God in so many ways. And so today, we're going to look at the list as a whole, not so much what each commandment is, but more of them as a whole, and what the list is, what it says about God, how it's necessary to us, and where it connects us to Jesus and His grace. And so our passages for today are very simple: Exodus 20, verses 1 and 2. And then Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 6. Exodus 20, verses 1 through 2. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 6. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and rules that I speak to in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at the time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up to the mountain. And he said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, those are the 2 passages that the 10 Commandments are in, and they are at once the same, and yet also occur at vastly different points in the history of God's people. The first, as you may know, occurring in Exodus 20, is just after God has rescued His people and delivered them out of Egypt in Pharaoh's hand. The second, Deuteronomy 5, is a restating of the first. It's a reminder of what He did in the Exodus, but it's also as the people are now finally about to enter the Promised Land. And in between that time, as you know, they wandered all around for a generation trying to figure out what was going on. So Moses in Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 3, says that they are laws and decrees, part of a covenant between God and His people. And that Moses says God made a covenant with them at Horeb, or you might also know it as Mount Sinai. Now, another word and more closer to reality is that God cut a covenant with His people. Now, you might remember that there was a covenant made with Abraham back in Genesis 15. And if you remember in that, this mic always gets stuck on me. If you remember in that covenant, Abraham has a vision. And in that vision of the covenant ceremony, a flaming fire pot walks in between the halves of several different types of animals. Well, back in those days, a suzerain vassal treaty was such that you separated those animals, and the vassal walked between them, saying, "Let what was done to these animals be done to me if I don't keep the stipulations of the covenant." Now, I don't know what Pastor Anthony has mentioned about this before or not. This is key. It unlocks the rest of the Bible. And I'm throwing it in extra. So this is actually not written in the sermon. Who walked through in Abraham's covenant? Yes, not Abraham. And when God did that, he said this: if you blow the covenant, I'll take the repercussions. And that led to Jesus on the cross. And that led to our Redeemer and our Savior. And in order to understand every other covenant, it's important to understand that. Because the suzerain didn't do that. But our suzerain did. And so now, again, coming back to the sermon, coming back to the Old Testament laws, the Ten Commandments, he cuts this covenant, okay? And the theological workbook of the Old Testament says that when a covenant was made between God and man, it was accompanied by signs, sacrifices, and a solemn oath that sealed their relationship with promises of blessing for keeping the covenant and curses for breaking it. And again, if you go through Deuteronomy, you go through Exodus, you'll see them. The people actually shout the blessings from one mountain and the cursings from another. Right? The opening words of this covenant reveal to us who is making it and what he has already done for his people. He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." And both texts are exactly the same, word for word. Now again, the Hebrew is a little clearer. It says that God brought them out of Egypt, the house of slavery. So the kingly party in this covenant is none other than our Redeemer from bondage. Again, this is very much in line with the suzerain vassal treaties of those days, where one of my professors says a conqueror would make a treaty with the conquered, in which he would benefit them with his protection and care as long as they abided by treaty stipulations. Now, at this point, some of you need coffee because you're glazing over, and you're saying, what does this history have to do with anything? That's great, Brad, but how does it impact my faith today? Why is this important? Egypt, the house of slavery, and the release from bondage by one who opposed God, foreshadows our own bondage to sin and release by Jesus Christ from Satan's claim upon our lives. Jesus came into the dungeon, threw open the door, took us out and released us from it, and said to the kingdom of that, or to the king of that rulership, said, "No, these are mine, they are not yours." And he released us from that. And that same picture is here in the Old Testament. So just as we now respond with joy and gratitude at God's gift of redemption from sin, so the Israelites were to do so in their freedom from Egypt. And part of that gratitude then is how we live our lives for God's glory. Because as God had compassion upon his people then, so he does today through Jesus Christ. And note this, because this is also key. As many scholars have stated, salvation was given to the people of Israel before the law. It was given to the people of Israel before the law. So one of them notes this. He says, with the Exodus came a change of masters. God's people were released from their bondage to Pharaoh in order to serve the true and living God. Not as captured slaves, but as liberated sons and daughters. The law that God gave them at the time of their emancipation was not a new form of bondage, but a freedom charter. He goes on to say, God did not set his people free so that they could do whatever they wanted, but so that they could live for him. That was the whole point of the Exodus. Moses kept telling Pharaoh, let my people go so that they may serve me. Exodus 7, verse 16. So this then points to one of the main uses of the law, teaching us how to live for God's glory in our relationship with him. And that's one thing I know is very important to the Reformed Church, is that idea, right? That idea that we were created to live for God's glory, to be in relationship with him. But in order to understand how these commandments do that, how they work as law in our lives, we have to understand the difference between a law code back then and the overly complex and convoluted American legal system that tries to govern every single action but leaves just enough loopholes that we all try to get away with, correct? Much different back then. In comparison, ancient law codes were more of a paradigmatic or teaching nature back then. Douglas Stewart, one of my professors in seminary, says they were models of behavior and models of prohibition or punishment related to those behaviors, but they made no attempt to be exhaustive. Ancient laws gave guiding principles or samples rather than complete descriptions of every single thing that was regulated. Ancient people were expected to use their minds and be able to extrapolate from the sampling of laws and what they did say to our general behavior so that they could live them out in their daily lives. So, for example, he mentions Exodus 22, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back five head of cattle for the ox or 4 sheep for the sheep. Now, a man couldn't then go into court and say, well, I didn't steal any sheep, I didn't steal any oxen, I stole a goat and a couple of chickens, but the law doesn't say anything about goats and chickens, so I'm cool. Right. Or he mentions Exodus 21:15. Anyone who attacks his father or mother must be put to death. Well, I didn't attack my father or mother, I beat my grandmother. Or another one, Exodus 21:18, if men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist and he does not die but he's confined to bed, if you go in and you tell a judge, I didn't punch him, I didn't use a stone, I kicked him and I used a branch to whip him, Dr. Stewart says you would insult the intelligence of everyone concerned and it would make no impact on their rendering judgment. In other words, you were supposed to be able to figure it out for yourself. I probably shouldn't do that, based on what these other laws say. And not everything had to be spelled out to the nth detail. Furthermore, each of what we call the 10, right? Each of the 10 is a summation of the 613 commands of God's people. And as such, it stands for a category of sins. And when I think of that picture, I think of the Jeopardy game show, the headings across the top and then the questions underneath. So think of the 10 as headings across the top, right? And they head a category of which they are over, and all those sins underneath it, in a sense, could lead up to that sin or be governed under that commandment. So again, for example, thou shalt not commit adultery. That might be a command that hopefully for many of us seems pretty easy to follow. It's a big sin. But the ancient Israelite would have understood that that commandment heads up a whole category where all sexual misconduct is prohibited, including before marriage. And so when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, where he really opens up the 10 Commandments many times, when he says, but I tell you, anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart, right? Deep down, God knows our heart. And what might seem like a little sin, lusting, oh boy, that's not the same as committing adultery. Jesus says they are the same. One leads to the other. One is part of the other. And God knows the inner heart, right? Understanding how the law code works and how Jesus rightly interprets it, again, especially in the Sermon on the Mount with things like lust and adultery and anger and murder. Did the kids say something like not murdering is pretty easy to keep? Yeah, but not getting mad, that's pretty hard. Right? I mean, if anybody has emotions rise to their forefront with their anger, it's like little kids. She slapped me, he pinched me, he took my toy, right? Things like that. Like, boom, the anger's right there. right? Understanding how the law code works and how Jesus rightly interprets it, there would be few, if any of us, who haven't broken the Ten Commandments. The point is, we are to see the underlying principles behind each command, think them through, apply them to our lives, and live for the glory of God. That is the first use of the law. Now, the second use of the law is the flip side of that. It's the one we generally think of. It's to restrain sin. Right? The law teaches and trains us what is right and what is wrong, so we will not live in opposition to God's will in society. This is law as a deterrent. In the same chapter, in Exodus 20:20, Moses says, "Do not be afraid, God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." Again, to deter you from doing wrong. That is often how we look at the Ten Commandments. I remember, this is probably going to date me, but a statement from when I was little: don't drink and chew and hang out with women who do. Anybody remember? Okay, apparently I lived in a foreign land. But I remember that statement and things like that we were told when we were little kids. But scholars also point this out. With each commandment, it's two-sided. They are both positive and negative. As one notes, where a sin is forbidden, the corresponding duty is required. Where there's a duty that's required, the corresponding sin is forbidden. So, for example, the third commandment says, the third commandment is don't take God's name in vain, right? The positive duty required of that then is what? To reverence his name, to praise his name, to give glory to his name, to call out in earnest joy, Davidman once wrote, C.S. Lewis's wife. Or how about this one? What's the eighth commandment? I think we need to go home and learn the Ten Commandments. Eighth commandment is do not steal, right? Are you really keeping the eighth commandment, someone once asked, about not stealing if you proclaim you've never stolen, but you're so stingy you've never helped somebody in need? Now, I know this is a Reformed church, a lot of Dutch background. Where I was in Iowa, we had several Reformed churches. My church was congregational, tended to be a little more Germanic-based. One thing that Germans are really good at, they can make a nickel out of 2 pennies. But don't ask them to give up that extra 3 cents, right? James writes in James 2:14-17, you may be able to say you've never stolen. But if you're so stingy that you won't help someone in need, you're not living out your faith. You may be keeping to the letter of the law, but like the Pharisees, you're not keeping to the spirit of it. And Jesus challenged the Pharisees over and over again that they missed the spirit of the law. See, this is one thing. Especially for you parents and you grandparents, this is important. We do not want our kids to grow up just to see the Ten Commandments as a list of do's and don'ts, or we are creating another generation of Pharisees. They need to understand the spirit of why this is important, how it connects us to God, how it teaches us to live rightly. We see that God gives us these to deter us from sin, but not just in outward action, but in our integrity, in our heart and soul. God's laws, rightly understood, they don't just govern outward action, they govern our inward heart. Again, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, but the things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. These are what make a man unclean. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. Philip Graham Ryken, president of Wheaton College, wrote a book that I used when I wrote these sermons called Written in Stone, the Ten Commandments in Today's Moral Crisis. And he writes of this inward-outward effect of the law on our daily living and how hard it is for many of us to maintain as Christians. And he said this, he said, we can now sympathize with the tribal chieftain who said, I would rather have the 7,777 commandments and prohibitions of the Taraja Adat than the 10 commandments of the Christian. For the 10 commandments demand my whole heart, but the 7,777 ancestral commands and prohibitions of the Taraja Adat leave room for a lot of freedom. That is the difference between the American legal system and God's law as well. And that leads us to the third use of the law, to show us our need for the gospel, the good news, a Redeemer, a Savior, Jesus Christ. None of us can keep the law perfectly. As it teaches us about God's holy nature, as it informs us how to follow Him, as it deters us from wrong and encourages us to the right, it also convicts us and condemns us when we sin, violate it, and fail. Paul writes in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." He also writes in Galatians 3:10, "All who rely on observing the law are under a curse, for it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law,'" which is actually a quote from the law in Deuteronomy 27, verse 26. And again, I'm sorry, I have to make this side note. My brother's a legal professor, and I believe when I was a pastor that it's also important to just make this statement. You must look at the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the books of the law, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Numbers, that great book that so many of us always get excited about, right? Look at them like a lawyer would look at his law library. When you look at them as a law library, and then you go through the history and the prophecies of the Old Testament, everything in those, every time they fail or every time they do something right, which isn't quite as often, always points back to the law, always points back to the blessings, always points back to the cursings. It always connects. And once you see that, it just opens up the Old Testament. And that's why I think it's so important when Jesus mentions it over and over in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, I got to stop adding these additions, or we'll be here forever, right? James also notes in James 2:10, For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point, is guilty of breaking it all. Now, we all, each and every one of us, are guilty before God. And yet, it says we only have to have sinned once. But frankly, how many of us has only sinned once? How many of you have ever only sinned once in your whole life? I see no hands, right? And how many of us have sinned more than once already this morning? I want to ask you to raise your hands, right? Because many of us struggle just getting here, right? Right? Especially if you have young children, perhaps, or you struggle getting up in the morning. It's hard. We live in difficult times. Right? But the law, while it can point to our need of being saved, the one thing the law cannot do is save us itself. Donald Gray Barnhouse once wrote this, and I think this is a great quote. He says, "The law of God is like a mirror. Now, the purpose of a mirror is to reveal to you that your face is dirty. But the purpose of the mirror is not to wash your face. When you look in a mirror and you find that your face is dirty, you don't reach and take the mirror off the wall and then use it to try to scrub the dirt off your face. It's not a cleansing agent. The purpose of the mirror is to drive you to the water." That is awesome. Because Jesus offers that water. The water that he offered the woman at the well. Here was a woman lost in sin, living with a man and having had 5 previous husbands. Jesus doesn't condemn her. The law has already done that. Instead, he offers her the water. He says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. but whoever drinks the water I give to him or her will never thirst. Indeed, the water that I give to that person will become in him or her a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And it is, I will give you, that it is very vague. You almost have to read between the lines, but I think there is just the smallest hint later in that text that she, in fact, when she went back, told the people, and they came back and said what they said to Jesus, I believe she actually did give her life to Jesus Christ. By God's grace. You see, law and grace are not opposed to one another. One points to the second, and that one points back to the other. The law convicts us of sin and points us towards God's grace, and having received God's grace, we go back to the law to know how to live for God's glory in our relationship with Him who freed us. We don't go back to the law to keep our salvation. We don't go back to the law to somehow add to our salvation. We go back to it because it teaches us how best to live for God's glory, to know what to do that is right and to deter us from wrong. We seek it as redeemed sinners rescued from our own Egypt, serving a new and loving master who has already proven his love and care and provision and faithfulness when he sent his Son who lived, died, and resurrected from the grave. And then the whole of the Bible opens up and is woven together like a beautiful tapestry. A tapestry of God's story of redemption. Michael Horton, who teaches at Westminster Seminary in California, says, a lot of times you'll find people who say, well, I don't really read the Old Testament. I just want to get to the New Testament. I want to get to Jesus. I want to get to love. He says, if you do that, if you discount the Old Testament and the law, it's like walking into a movie halfway into the story. It's like thinking you're telling a good joke, but all you can remember is the punchline. By the way, did you hear the one about the 3 strings? And he replied to the bartender, I'm afraid not. Now, my wife, my kids, they all hate that joke because it takes like 10 minutes to tell, and you really have to pay attention at the end, which most people are asleep. But did you get the joke? No, you didn't get the joke because you missed the 10 minutes in between, right? Because you skipped ahead. You discounted the rest of the important story. We cannot separate the law from the gospel. The legalism that so many people get concerned with when you bring up the 10 Commandments is not there if we preach truthfully about the law and grace. J. Gresham Machen once said, a low view of law brings legalism and religion, but a high view actually makes a man a seeker after grace. And so we come to the 10 Commandments over the next 5 years. Some of you are still awake. We come to the 10 Commandments, looking at them. Why? To see and know God better. To know how to live for His glory, to learn the right to pursue and the wrong to be deterred from, but finally, falling on our knees convicted of sin, finding our redemption in Jesus Christ. I picked 3 hymns today. 3 hymns. These are near and dear hymns to my heart. These are the hymns that will be played at my funeral. I know that sounds bizarre. I'm a hospice chaplain. Sorry. Why did I pick these 3? Well, I love them first. A Mighty Fortress is Our God. What is that hymn? It's an old Germanic hymn by Martin Luther that shows in the power of you playing and us singing who God is. And Amazing Grace is that powerful story of the writer, a former slaver, finding God's grace and being forgiven. So it's a powerful story of who God is, what he has done for us. And then this old Irish hymn, Be Thou My Vision. What is it? It is a psalm to send us forth with a passion to do his will. Who God is, what he's done for us, how we live for him. I believe those are powerful hymns. And when you weave those together into a service, even the Old Testament 10 Commandments, I believe it paints a beautiful picture of what God has done for us. It's not a picture of legalism. It's a picture of freedom to live for someone you're in a relationship with who loves you and we love as well. Let's pray.